In Exodus chapter 20, in the middle of the Ten Commandments, when God talks to his people of Israel, he tells them that he is a jealous God. For some of us, that is a little unnerving because we tend to see jealousy as just a very negative emotion. How can God have that negative emotion? But this word jealousy in other passages is also translated zeal. And so it is a reference to a certain attitude that God has toward his people. In Exodus chapter 20, though, he speaks of that jealousy in the sense that because he is their God and they are his people, they are to have no other gods, that he is to be the only God. And he makes the point that he expresses that jealousy in two ways. One is visiting the iniquity on those who are guilty, and the second is to show his steadfast love. And this morning we want to focus on the visiting of the iniquity in this case. And that has some interesting meaning. So if we look at the passage in Exodus 20 and verse 5, where this rule is given to us, it says of him, it says, "You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Jehovah your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on their children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." So in order to understand this, we need to ask the question, what does he mean by the word iniquity? And iniquity is a word that indicates a sin that is particularly evil in God's eyes because it strongly has the idea of taking that which is true and twisting it or perverting it or changing it and doing that deliberately. A couple of weeks ago in our Wednesday evening class, we were talking about Elymas, the sorcerer, with Sergius Paulus, and Paul told him that that's what he was doing with God's word, that he was constantly twisting it. So he would take what was true and make it something that was more believable, to something that was more pleasing to other people. So it's particularly horrible that you would do this, that you would distort God's truth, that you would make it crooked. When this word is used, though, it's interesting, is I think you can see even from this passage, that it speaks not only of the sin that is committed, but it also speaks of the punishment that is involved. So when he says visiting the iniquity on them, there's an understanding that they did something wrong and that God is going to deal with it. So sometimes you'll see this word used very closely with the idea of, for lack of a better word at this point, punishment, of the consequences of the sin that is involved. Now, having described it as being so bad, what we also need to realize from passages like Psalm, the 32nd chapter, where David acknowledges his sin before God, he says, I acknowledge my sin to you. I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to Jehovah, and you forgive the iniquity of my sin. You forgive the iniquity of my sin. If we confess our sins, and in other passages repent of those sins, God will forgive them. So even when we take that which God has given us and we twist it, he's willing to forgive those things. The other expression that's used in this verse is hate. Hate in the Bible, we use it almost always as a very final thing, the opposite of love, but it's kind of one of those Hebrew words that has a spectrum that goes from loathing something to disliking something. But in this case, it probably has the idea of someone who is hostile toward God. And they show that by their iniquity. And that's where I want us to go for an example of understanding God's zeal or jealousy to Numbers, the 13th chapter. Numbers chapter 13 and 14, I think most of us are familiar with the story in this passage of the people of Israel finally arriving at the entrance to the land of Canaan. So they have come there, and God tells them that they are to send the spies into the land. So one man from each tribe goes into the land, and after they do that, they come back with a report. And at the very end of the 13th chapter, we see that there was like a majority report and a minority report. And the majority report of the people was that they could not and they should not enter into the land of Canaan. He said, we can't go in there because they are stronger than we are. And God describes this as a bad report. Joshua and Caleb, of course, gave a good report. The bad guys, the majority report said, this is a land that devours the inhabitants. And I don't know that I've ever thought of a land or a place that I visited and said, now that's a place that just devours. What does that mean? It's not a good thing, is it, though? Why would we want to go into a land that devours its inhabitants? And there's giants there, and the Nephilim, they say, and he said, we see ourselves as grasshoppers, and that's how they see us. We can't go in. We can't make it. The people that night, we're told in the passage, in the beginning of the 14th chapter, it says they cry out loud at night, they spend the night weeping, and then all the people begin grumbling against Moses and Aaron. The word grumbling, I think the translation Ken used earlier today used the word complaining. This is not just muttering under one's breath. This is more than just saying, man, I can't believe I have to take out the trash again. That's not the kind of grumbling we're talking about. This is a much more serious thing that's being dealt with. It has to do with, there's a sense of resentment against God. There's a sense of dissatisfaction with God, of anger toward Him. And that anger and resentment is expressed not only to God, but against His leaders. And that's the main word, the way this word grumble is being used. If you mumble against God's leaders, are you mumbling against God? If He's chosen those leaders, the answer is absolutely. Now, this is not the first time this word is used in the people of Israel. Multiple times as they went through the land, we see them grumbling. Did they have reason to? Well, we need to understand that there's an answer to that question. It's a sort of. There were times where they didn't have water. For all the people, there wasn't enough water. So what did they do? Well, instead of trusting God, they grumbled. But God took care of them. And when they were without food, they grumbled. Now, it doesn't take me long to go without food or water, where I kind of get upset too, right? We struggle with exactly that. But it's more than just that they said, we don't have anything to eat, or please give us something to eat. If you go back to those stories, do you see what they actually did was they doubted God. God can't provide for us the way that we need provided for. They doubted His justice. They doubted His goodness. They doubted His power. They questioned all those things. In Numbers 14, we see just the extent of this grumbling in this passage. It says in that passage, I'm going to start reading in verse 2. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is Jehovah bringing us to this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. I'm going to suggest to you this morning that what they're doing here is iniquity. And we're going to see God's zealous reaction to that iniquity in this passage. The whole congregation, do you notice where they begin with how they think about God? Would that we had died in the land of Egypt. Now, this is months after they've left Egypt. And before this time, they had cried out to God for salvation from the Egyptians and from the slavery that they were in. And now they're at the point where saying, well, I wish we just died back there. Think for a moment, what are they thinking about God? Are they not completely dismissing the salvation that Jehovah gave them from the slavery in Egypt? Do you see what I mean? That this is grumbling. It's not just a muttering under your breath complaining. This is saying, I wish God had never saved us. I don't know about you, but that's pretty serious. That seems really serious to me. Or would that we had died in this wilderness. What had God done for the people of Israel in the wilderness? Well, we know that they had complained over and over again. God says a little bit later in Numbers 14 that he had done 10 signs for them. So you have the 10 plagues. He speaks of the 10 signs that he had done for them in the wilderness. Would that we had died in the wilderness. He fed them. He gave them water. Their sandals didn't wear out. Their clothing didn't wear out. He took care of them throughout that. And he led them to this land of promise. Oh, that we had died in the wilderness says we don't care about Jehovah's leadership. We don't care about the provision that he's given to us. We wish we would just die. It's hard to imagine. And then they say, why is Jehovah bringing us to this land so that we just die by the sword and our children will become prey? How are they thinking about God now? God had promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that they would inherit this land. And yes, it's 450 years later. That's a long time. But you understand what they're doing here is they're dismissing the promises of Jehovah. God promised they would enter that land, and they're saying, well, he can't do it. Because we're all going to die by the sword, and our children are going to be taken captive. He can't do it. You see why this is iniquity? Their charges, their grumbling is pretty harsh. And then they said, would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? Let's pick a leader. And this is the one that really hurts, isn't it? Because now they're not just saying that they're just missing what God has done. Isn't this a rejection of Jehovah himself? When they say we're going to choose a different leader. Dismissing what he's done for them. They dismissed what he was doing for them. They dismissed what he would do for them. And they dismissed him. Now just for a moment, I know that none of us can be exactly in that place, but just try to imagine that you're in the place of God. How would these accusations strike you? None of us would be very, very happy with anyone who said things like that. And we're going to see that displeasure. Keep that in mind. Now, of course, Joshua and Caleb gave the minority report, which was, let's go into the land, for we can do it. Jehovah's with us. It's there. But they gave this warning in verse 9. Only do not rebel against Jehovah. And that tells us what the 10 spies led the whole congregation to doing. It was rebellion against God. So Moses and Aaron, they go to pray. And they remind God. And this is the part that Ken read a little bit earlier. So I just want to remind you of the things that we see in these verses. Moses and Aaron remind God that if he doesn't bring the people into the land, the Egyptians are not going to think that he's really God, that he's not a God that should be worshipped or the God that should be followed. In verse 17, he reminds them of what he had said in the 10 Commandments. They go back and they say, you are a great God. These are the things that you have promised, that you would be slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. You would forgive iniquity and transgression, and he reminds them, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity on the sons. This almost directly from Exodus 20 and the Ten Commandments. Written on stone. That they would do that. And then Moses says, please pardon the iniquity of the people, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. I want you to understand that what we're looking at in these verses is about forgiveness. That over and over, God had been forgiving their sins, forgiving the grumbling, forgiving the rebellion. And once again, Moses comes before him and says, please pardon them. And you'll notice in verse 20, Jehovah says something astonishing. I have pardoned. From now on, everything that we read about what happened has to be read with that understanding. God pardoned their grumbling, which I defined earlier, and I hope you agree with me, as iniquity. I pardoned it. Were bad things about to happen? Difficult things about to happen? Yes. He's about to tell them exactly what he thought of what they were doing and the consequences of those things. As Ken read that, what I hope you notice is what he said about them. They did not obey my voice. They've seen the signs. They've seen them over and over. They saw my glory, but they didn't obey me. They didn't listen. And so, you're going to die in the wilderness. You've despised me. Doesn't that seem harsh? Did they really despise Jehovah? Over and over, actually, yes, they despised him. But by going back and saying, we wish you wouldn't have saved us, we wish you wouldn't have taken care of us in the wilderness, we don't think you can bring us home, that's despising God. And then saying, well, we're just going to go back. That is despising God. Caleb is mentioned in verse 24. Caleb and, Joshua, thank you. I don't know.
I have it all the time.
I guess I always say Joshua and Caleb, but he says of them in verse 24, they have a different spirit. And this is an important point about why they are not included in this, is because their spirit is different. But what that tells us is the spirit of the people was truly messed up. It had turned against God. And so he describes it as a wicked congregation. And he talks about the grumbling that they do against him that we examined already. And again, your dead bodies are going to fall in the wilderness. He says that. He says, you've rejected the land that I've given you, and your dead bodies are going to fall in the wilderness. And he describes it as faithlessness in verse 33. Faithlessness. They didn't trust him. And your dead bodies are going to lie in the wilderness. There's kind of a pattern with that, right? You're not going into the land. Your bodies are going to be in the wilderness. And then he says, you will bear your iniquity for 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I want you to think about this for a minute. Bear the iniquity. Because what had God already said about this? I have pardoned. But you're going to bear the iniquity. Sin's forgiven. But there's still these consequences. This was not done lightly or spontaneously by God. What I mean by that is like sometimes when a child does a minor infraction, sometimes a parent will say, well, you're grounded for the rest of your life. Go to your room. You know, sometimes just in the heat of the moment. I want you to understand that this is not just God in the heat of a moment overreacting. There is a purpose for what God is doing. And this is an expression of his zealousness for taking care of them. That even though they have committed iniquity, and that he has pardoned the iniquity, they are going to bear the consequences of their iniquity for 40 years. And God has a reason for doing that. We're going to see what that is in a moment. The next thing that he says of them, again, he describes them as a wicked congregation. They gathered together against me, which is an amazing phrase. And of course, they'll come to a full end, he says, and they're going to die in the wilderness. Remember I asked you earlier, if you were God, how would you react to the fact they dismissed your salvation, your provision and leadership, and your promises? This is how God felt about it. He tells them very, very clearly what they've done and what he's going to do. Now that passage ends with a great expression of that, in that those 10 spies die from a plague immediately. So they saw that, and now they know they're going to be in that situation. So let me ask you a question. What does this teach us about Jehovah's zeal? If I despise Jehovah, does he know it? Does he care? Is he displeased? Will he pardon? Yes. Will there be consequences that we will have to bear? And there are reasons for that. I want you to turn with me to Isaiah 59. These are important lessons about his zeal, because sometimes when we look at that jealousy, we think this is just a bad thing happening. In Isaiah 59, we see God coming with this justice of his. And we're going to start reading in verse 14, if you'll join me there. Isaiah 59, verse 14. He describes the condition of God's people at this time. Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away. For truth has stumbled in the public squares, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. Jehovah saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. He saw that there was no man, and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation, and his righteousness upheld him. He put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds, so will he repay wrath to his adversaries, repayment to his enemies. To the coastlands he will render repayment, so that they fear the name of Jehovah from the west and his glory from the rising of the sun, for he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of Jehovah drives. And a Redeemer will come to Zion, and to those in Jacob who turn from transgression, declares Jehovah. I really like this passage. There's no justice in the land. It fits exactly with what we were saying with the spies, doesn't it? Jehovah sees it. It displeases him. In this case, he says there's no man who's going to stand up for what's right. So at least there were Caleb and Joshua back in those days. But here, no one is standing for what's right. So who comes? Jehovah. Righteousness for his breastplate, salvation on his head, and sometimes we stop there because that's what we're used to hearing. But what else does he say? Vengeance for clothing. He's going to deal with the wickedness. And wrapped around him like a cloak or a mantle is zeal. Which means not only is he doing this, but he's doing this because he cares deeply about what's happening. Did you see that happening with the spies? Did God, Jehovah, did he care deeply about their rebellious attitude? What a lesson he teaches us. So here we have God coming with vengeance. And what does he say that he's going to do in verse 18? He says, I'm going to repay them. There's going to be wrath, repayment. He says it 3 times. There are consequences for that. He's coming with his wrath, and he's going to deal with that for those who are involved in the wickedness. But then what I want you to know is verse 19. So they shall. Here's the purpose. Here's the reason that Jehovah visits his iniquity, the iniquity of people, on his people and on the future, later generations. What does he say? So that they will fear Jehovah. They will fear the name of Jehovah. From the west, the glory from the rising sun, they need to fear Jehovah. We think, if we look back at those 40 years in the wilderness, that's pretty harsh punishment. That for that moment of rebellion, they're sentenced to 40 years in the wilderness. But understand that that 40 years in the wilderness was a teaching lesson for the people of Israel, that they would learn to fear God and honor him as God. Because people who say, I don't care that I was saved, I don't care that you take care of me and you can't keep your promises, need to learn a lesson about fearing God and knowing who he is. The visiting of the iniquity on them was not just punishment. He was using that time in the wilderness to teach. We need to learn that. That our God wants us to fear him, and he tries to help us learn to do that. It's not always as gentle, maybe, as we might like, but there's a reason. And that's what we have to trust about him. And there's another lesson he tells us in verse 20. What is he getting us ready for? A Redeemer will come to Zion. We haven't talked about this much. But the very idea that the people in Caleb and Joshua's time had, that they were going to go back to Egypt, who did they think was going to redeem them and save them? They were going to do it for themselves. He can't get us into that land, so we're just going to go back to Egypt. And they saw themselves as their redeemers. Do we have that problem? That we think that we are going to be our own redeemers. A redeemer will come from Zion. They needed to learn that lesson of having someone to look forward to. And so that's what we need to look forward to. And when we have that, that's just an amazing thing. God says, a redeemer's going to come and I'm going to have a covenant with him. That's in verse 21. He's going to renew that covenant together. Visiting the iniquity is about all those things. So how does it apply to us today? Those are old stories from the book of Numbers and Isaiah. How does that apply to us today? I guess the first question we have to ask is, has God's jealousy, has God's zeal, has it changed? Nope. That's one of the things we know about our God, though that doesn't change. Our God will judge, and he will judge righteously. That judgment is coming, and God is zealous about it. The judgment is very real, and it's very final. And when it's dealing with the enemies, he uses words that say destruction will be a part of that. When the Israelites fell in the wilderness, they died in the wilderness. There was destruction in the wilderness. Romans, the 2nd chapter, he asks this question about people who think that they were righteous but were not. He says, do you think that you will escape the judgment of God? God's zeal is an answer for that. Will I escape the judgment of God? Nope, because God is zealous. In Hebrews, the 2nd chapter, and verse 11, when he talks about those stories from of old, he says about the message of the angels that proved reliable. Every transgression and disobedience received a just retribution. Do we know that from the scriptures? Those things really happened. God showed himself that he would visit the iniquity on the people. How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? There's lessons here for us, isn't there? So it makes me think back. I know my God is a jealous and zealous God. So how do I compare with the people of Israel? How am I thinking about God today? Or maybe, how do I think about God every day? Just yesterday. How did yesterday go when you're thinking about God? Did you talk to Him? Did you listen to Him by reading from His Word? Or were you too busy for it? Did you just miss God yesterday by your actions? Or some other day, did you disregard Him? And do you not think that you will find a zealous God? Did you think about your salvation? The salvation of sin that was given to you through Jesus Christ. The sacrifice that He made with joy. Do you think about it with that joy and that sense of determination? Or are you like the Israelites who just say that didn't matter? Oh no, those words would never come out of our mouths, right? But that's not exactly what they said either. But the essence of what they said, we don't care about the fact that God saved me. We can do that by how we live each day. Did you put your trust in Him throughout the day? Did you submit yourself to His leadership and provision? Did you show that in your contentment and in your thankfulness? The way that you lived before Him? Did you think about your hope of heaven? Being with Him for eternity? Or do you think He can't keep that promise? Whose lead did you really follow? Your own lead? Or did you really follow Him? Our God is a zealous and jealous God. We need to know that He will visit iniquity on us. But understand, you can be pardoned. You still might have to bear the iniquity. But even if you do, it's not just God punishing you. He wants to help you come back to Him so that you follow Him with a whole heart. When we say our God is a jealous God, there's nothing negative about that, even in the sense that He visits the iniquity on us and on our children, and our children's children to the third and the fourth generation. It's not just punishment after punishment after punishment. It's fear me, honor me, glorify me, and be my people. He wants us in that relationship. I hope I've helped you a little bit this morning with thinking about God and His jealousy and zeal. We want to offer an opportunity this morning. If anyone here is not a follower of Jesus Christ, you can become one today. It's not an easy path, but it's one that brings us back into a relationship with our Father. And if you're ready because you believe in Him, you're ready to turn away from those sins, be baptized so the sins can be washed away, please come forward. Please stand and sing.